Madam President.
Senator from West Virginia.
Madam President, I rise today to speak about the dire finances of this great...
Senate's in quorum call.
Quorum call? Suspend the quorum call?
Yes,
I'd like to ask the consent to suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to speak about the dire finances of this great nation and the policies and laws of this government that are only weakening our fiscal standing for future generations. A year ago, I was in a Senate Armed Services Committee meeting, and then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, was asked, what's the greatest threat to our nations and our national security? And I would have thought that he would have said terrorism, the terrorists, Al-Qaeda, North Africa, could have been Iran, could have been another rising military power. But he didn't hesitate in responding, and he said the national debt is our greatest threat to this country. That was one of the most sobering moments I've experienced since becoming a United States Senator. I would have thought that more people would hear what I heard and take out the situation and take this situation more seriously. But things have only gotten worse since then. Our debt ceiling is at a record high, $16.4 trillion. By 2022, according to the President's newly proposed budget, we will be $25.9 trillion in debt. That means that every man, woman, and child will be responsible for more than $79,000 of debt. Our children and grandchildren will be paying more in interest on the debt than we spend on education, energy, and defense combined. Our elected leaders should be negotiating solutions, but instead, everyone's cooking up short-term Band-Aids that create long-term obligations that will take years for future generations to repay. They're trying to figure out how to point fingers at the other side. There's not a person in West Virginia who can understand why politics is trumping our future fiscal stability. I don't think there's a person in America who understands why in Washington we can't come together on a long-term fix to the problems we have. And for the life of me, I cannot imagine why our elected leaders from both sides of the aisles are continuing to play political football with our spending, our debt, and our children's future. This isn't how we reach a solution. When I was governor of the state of West Virginia, I didn't blame previous administrations for our problems. I took the responsibility for fixing them. And I didn't come here to blame anyone for our problems either. I came here to fix them. I didn't come here to put the next generation into more debt. I came here to get them out of it. I came here to serve my state in Washington because my parents and grandparents left me a country that was in very sound fiscal shape, and I want to do the same for the next generation. I came here because in West Virginia, even during a recession, we lived within our means and had a surplus every year that I was governor. The people of my state are proud of what our little state accomplished. And I know Americans can again feel that same pride in this great nation of ours. I know that we can put our fiscal house back in order. I had those priorities in mind when I looked at the President's proposed budget, the projected deficits, the accumulated debt over the next decade, and wondered, what in the world are we doing? This budget claims to be balanced, but only if we don't count the exploding interest that we must pay on our ever-increasing debt. Including interest, there is not a single year that this budget is balanced. At the end of the decade, this budget puts an additional $6.7 trillion more in debt. And I would ask anybody, how does that make sense? This is not the first time I've shared my concerns about this country going down the wrong fiscal track. And I can already hear some folks saying, oh, there goes Joe Manchin again, blaming President Obama. Well, let me tell you, I'm a proud Democrat, but I'm a proud West Virginian and American first. And I would stand up and speak my mind whether our president is a Democrat or Republican. And I'm trying to be as understanding and respectful as possible in my critique. But what we're doing just doesn't make any sense at all to me. And I certainly can't in good conscience try to tell the people of West Virginia any different. And if we don't do anything to address this fiscal mess, the priorities of both Democrats and Republicans will face the consequences. Standing here, I tell my Democratic friends that we must face the truth, that the very programs that we care so dearly about, that we fight so hard for, will be destroyed unless we do something about this exploding debt. Standing here, I also tell my Republican friends that they too must face the truth that not only will the programs that they care about will be destroyed, but that they may be forced to one day support a massive tax increase to simply keep this country solvent. Both scenarios are unacceptable and preventable. There is a common-sense solution to our nation's dire fiscal woes within our grasp. We already have a template with substantial bipartisan support, split evenly between Democrats and Republicans in both the House and the Senate. That gives us a starting point to move forward with. As I have said before, the Bowles-Simpson framework might not be perfect, but it has more support from both sides of the aisle than anything else that I have seen since I got here. Not only what it withstood the test of time, it has done it better than any other proposal I've seen. It is a framework that cuts trillions from our debt, makes our tax system more fair, and raises revenue without raising tax rates. The only problem is that our country's leaders from both parties won't move forward with the recommendations of the Bowles-Simpson Commission. So instead of real solutions where we choose our priorities based on our values, we see political proposals that will only send this country further into a death spiral of debt. Take, for example, the fact that this body will soon debate extending the so-called payroll tax cut for the remainder of this year. 10 more months. Let's call that what it really is. It truly is cutting funding to Social Security. This Congress has voted twice since I've been here to tell Americans that they don't have to pay their share as far as the obligation to Social Security. I voted for the idea the first time around because I thought, as it was proposed to me, that it might create more jobs or save jobs. But I don't think that we've seen much evidence that that's happened. And so I decided to stop throwing good money after bad and stop jeopardizing Social Security. But as I warned this fall, along with my dear friend, Senator Mark Kirk, who all our prayers are with, and now we're talking about extending this policy indefinitely, because once something like this is enacted, even an act of Congress can't reverse it. It might only take an act of God to reverse it. Now, I know that going back home and saying, we voted for tax cuts is popular. Everybody wants to be popular in this arena. But this is not a tax cut. This is a Social Security cut. Plain and simple, and you cannot make it look any different. And knowing that we're adding 10,000 beneficiaries turning 65 years of age every day. And when you look at last year, Social Security was the first time that we paid out more than we took in. That doesn't make any sense. Just what exactly will continuing this policy do to the long-term solvency of Social Security? The answer is really simple. It'll be a disaster. Now, the so-called experts will tell you that everything will be right because we'll backfill those contributions with revenue from our general fund. Let me remind you that this is the fourth straight year that the general fund has operated with a deficit of more than $4 trillion. That has never happened in the life of this great country. We've accumulated $15.36 trillion of debt as of today, and the President just allowed that to grow to $16.4 trillion with a new debt ceiling. The same experts who tell us that we can balance a budget if we simply ignore the fundamentals of math. Now, does that make sense? Madam President, when this body votes on whether to extend the so-called payroll tax cut, or as it should be more accurately described, the defunding of Social Security's revenue stream, I cannot in good conscience vote to undermine Social Security. I've taken this position because at the end of the day, the people of West Virginia and this nation must be told the truth, which is why the budget proposal the President offered this week is so disappointing and maddening. Now, let's be clear. Both Republicans and Democrats are responsible for our budget problems. Everybody is responsible where we are today. In fairness, this administration inherited a tremendous debt, falling revenues, and a terrible economy. Everyone was at fault, and the public spoke loud and clear. They changed things with the 2008 election, and they said, fix it. But we haven't done it, and this budget doesn't do it either. If we are going to address our fiscal nightmare and stop digging a deeper debt hole, we must have a meaningful tax reform that not only ensures that everybody pays their fair share, but that also strengthens our economy and creates jobs, good jobs. Instead, this budget is not balanced even once over the next decade. It would actually add an additional $6.7 trillion of more debt on top of the $16.4 trillion debt ceiling that we have now that the President just authorized. That's more than $23 trillion of debt by 2022. That is simply unsustainable. This proposed budget relies too much on phantom accounting from the so-called war savings, from a war that should have been over when its purpose changed to what I call nation building. In terms of energy investment, one area that business and labor both believe is critical to not only creating more jobs, but keeping the good jobs that we have, this administration continues to pick winners and losers. Take the role of coal, for example. As I just pointed out in the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, the administration's own Department of Energy forecasts that coal will play a major role in the energy portfolio well into the coming decades, up through 2035. But this budget slashes funding for the research that would allow us to use coal more efficiently and more cleanly with environmental standards that we must be responsible for. Mr. President, Madam President, this doesn't make sense. And it puts the livelihoods of an awful lot of West Virginians and Americans in jeopardy. Those priorities defy common sense, especially when millions of people depend on coal for their jobs and the affordable, dependable, and reliable electricity that it produces. We're spending more where we don't need to and less where we do. We're extending programs that do not work and going into debt to pay for them. And then we wonder why this great nation faces such a dire fiscal future. So if and when the President's budget proposal comes up for a vote, I simply cannot support it. As always, though, I will continue to work diligently with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to push for a more common-sense fiscal approach based on the bipartisan Bowles-Simpson template so we can finally and responsibly address the fiscal problems our nation and our families face. And I urge the President and my colleagues to do the same. Madam President, allow me to close by saying that I do travel my state like most of my colleagues, and I'm sure that you do in Missouri. I meet with my constituents like you do also, and I can tell you what I find out from them. There are a lot of issues that they're worried about. There are some places where they disagree, but there's one issue that gets universal agreement and brings everybody together. When they tell us to a person they are concerned that those of us in Washington aren't listening to their cries to put the country ahead of our politics. They urge all of us to stand up and do what is right for this country. We must not let selfish ambitions about the next election cloud what must be done for the nation that I know that we all love. The challenge before us is a simple one. Over the course of our history, this nation has succeeded because our parents and grandparents left our country better off than what they inherited from their parents and grandparents. Madam President, we can't be the first generation to fail to leave the United States in better shape for the next generation. I don't want to be a part of that. I do not intend to stand by and let a party or politics destroy the hopes of the next generation for this great country. And I urge all of our congressional leaders and our President to put politics aside and realize one simple fact. Whether we are Democrats or Republicans or independents, we all belong to the same party, and that party is called America. And we will rise or fall together. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor, and I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Both the Senate and the U.S. House considering separate surface transportation bills this week. The Senate bill, 2 years, $109 billion. Not much debate on the Senate floor today about it. David Hawkins in CQ writes that the Senate convened at 10 for a day of speech-making and clock-watching on the highway bill, which appears stalled until the next procedural vote tomorrow. The only real movement, a move by Rand Paul, senator from Kentucky, to introduce his resolution, which would temporarily suspend U.S. foreign aid to Egypt in protest over the 19 arrested U.S. aid workers in Egypt. Barbara Boxer of California objected to the amendment, and that's about as far as they've gotten in terms of progress on the transportation bill. Off the floor of the Senate, meanwhile, the Foreign Relations Committee approved by a voice vote a resolution which would condemn the actions of the al-Assad regime in Syria. That happened today in the Foreign Relations Committee. So the Senate in a quorum call here. Meanwhile, over in the House, they'll gavel back in about an hour or so to resume consideration of the first part of the transportation bill on the House side, 5 years, $260 billion bill, which House leaders a couple of days ago decided to split into several parts in an effort to overcome opposition to parts of the transportation bill. The first piece of it deals largely with oil and gas drilling, including expansion into the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and approval of the Keystone XL pipeline. They'll finish up work today, likely finish up work on amendments, and final approval of that portion of the transportation bill is expected this afternoon in the House. They come in at around 3 o'clock, we expect, and you can follow the House on our companion network, C-SPAN. With the underlying business, the transportation bill, 2-year, $109 billion transportation bill. One of the reasons both here in the Senate and the House things are in a bit of a holding pattern is the payroll tax cut conference last night. Late last night, they reached an apparent agreement over moving forward with that, and reportedly will sign the final conference report in about 10 minutes at 2:15 Eastern. Congressional Quarterly wrote this morning about that negotiators and congressional leaders had tried to meet a midnight deadline for completing a final version of the legislation, which would extend the payroll tax break and federal unemployment benefits and head off a cut in Medicare payments to physicians. CQ writes the leaders hope to clear the package for President Obama's signature before the President's Day congressional recess begins at the end of the week. So again, they're reportedly headed for a meeting at 2:15 to sign the final conference report.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we voted 85 to 11 to start work on the highway bill, which is an essential piece of legislation to reauthorize our highway and transit programs. 868 days have passed since our last federal transportation bill expired. And if you can't do the math very fast, just to put a little more emphasis on that, that's 2 years, 4 months, and 18 days since the last federal transportation bill expired. We need new legislation to help streamline federal programs, spur job creation, and move our transportation system into the 21st century. This transportation bill before us is about infrastructure. And we call it infrastructure because infra means below. So it is the foundation beneath which everything else about our civilized country is built, as we think about the buildings and operating our municipalities and our states and our federal government, our country. It's about making sure that we have a sound infrastructure. Our businesses, our workers, our innovators, all of them rely on a system of quality infrastructure to succeed. More funding for transportation in this bill means we can do critical roads and bridges. We can do repairs to the existing roads and bridges. It means we have more transit for buses and railroads, and that means we can put people back to work. More jobs for construction and manufacturing workers. More jobs for workers means more consumer spending and a stronger overall economy. The Federal Highway Administration estimates that for every $1 billion that we spend on highway, that spending supports more than 27,000 jobs. And economists at Moody's estimate that for every dollar that we invest in infrastructure, our gross domestic product goes up by $1.59. That's because of the ripple effect that those investments have in our economy. The bill before us would help create about 1 million American jobs, many of them in the construction industry, which has been one of the hardest hit by the recession. In New Hampshire, the number of people who are working in the construction industry in 2010 was the lowest it's been in a decade, 25% lower than it was in just 2006, so just 5 years ago. We need to pass this bill to help put those people back to work. One of the most important efforts that we have in New Hampshire right now is the long overdue and badly needed widening of Interstate 93, which is in the southern part of New Hampshire. I-93 is our state's most important highway. It connects New Hampshire citizens to their jobs, businesses to global markets, and communities to each other. Right now, this vital artery is badly clogged. Every day, 100,000 cars travel on a road designed for 60,000. This congestion wastes time and it wastes money. And crowding so many vehicles on Interstate 93 is not only an inconvenience to the thousands who use it every day, but it also compromises the safety of drivers traveling at regular highway speeds in heavy traffic. The Interstate 93 project was budgeted and planned based on the idea that the federal government would provide a consistent level of funding, but the uncertainty created by the lack of a long-term highway bill has made the project difficult to finance. Right now, New Hampshire transportation officials have $115 million worth of bonding for this project that's sitting on the sidelines until the federal government makes good on its commitments. We need to move these federal funds off the sidelines and get this project going. Laura Scott, who's the Economic Development Director for the town of Windham, near the Massachusetts border, summed it up best. The I-93 project is critical to the future economic vitality of Windham and all of southern New Hampshire, she said. Our businesses want it, our citizens want it, and we need to get it done. The bill before us today can help complete this vital project and others like it. And we need to work on this bill in a bipartisan fashion, just as it's come out of the Environment and Public Works Committee. They had a strong bipartisan support coming out of that committee. We need to set aside the partisanship now, the election year amendments, and come together to do what's right for our economy and our country. And I hope that in the end, all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will support that. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Tennessee.
President, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I've come down here today to talk about a topic that I spoke a little bit yesterday on the floor about, and I know that all the focus right now is working on a solution to some of the things that are going on between the House and Senate, and I know that's what people are focused on today. I know that probably sometime tomorrow there'll be a vote on the highway bill that'll fail, and then my understanding is that there'll be some amendments brought forth to bring a finance bill, a EPW bill, a commerce bill, and a banking bill together that will actually be debated, and it's my sense will ultimately pass, and that we'll be doing that after the recess is over. We'll come back and deal with that. And I just want to speak to that topic, and I know I'm becoming a little bit of a broken record on this, but we've had so many people down here on both sides of the aisle that have actually worked for a year and a half after the Bowles-Simpson report came out. We had so many people who tried to work on together on long-term deficit reduction, pro-growth tax reform, entitlement reform. And there seemed to be a real seriousness about that issue, and I think all of the people who've signed letters in support of it were very, very sincere. And yet I think what we're finding with this highway bill, in spite of the changes that are likely to take place with the finance component, that what we're ending up with is a highway bill, and I can tell you there's nobody in this bill in this body that likes infrastructure more than me, or has spent more time on the back of a paving machine or on a screed. I mean, those are the kind of things that I love seeing happening. I know they create jobs and tremendous economic growth over the long haul. But what we're ending up with in this highway bill is a situation where we have 2 years' worth of spending that is taking place, and we're using 10 years' worth of pay-fors. Now, I know the presiding officer remembers the debate that we had for a long, long time here in this body over health care. And I know the presiding officer remembers the tremendous discussions that took place on the floor over the financing mechanisms. And I don't think there's any question that people on my side of the aisle railed strongly, I might say, as they should have, over the fact that we were going to had a pay-for formula where basically we were spending money over a 6-year period and paying for it over 10. And ultimately the bill passed, but there was tremendous divide in this body over really mostly just the budget gimmickry that took place. And yet what I see getting ready to happen in a large bipartisan way is we're going to vote for a highway bill, possibly. I'm not going to do that, but a bill that spends money over a 2-year period and recoups it over 10. I'm actually stunned by this. And, you know, we talk about all the things we need to do in this body regarding Medicare and how we need to focus on reforms that make sure that the seniors in Vermont and the seniors in Tennessee have these programs down the road. We talk about Medicare in the same light. I think all of us want to make sure that Social Security is here for future generations, for these young people in front of us, and all of us know that we've got to figure out a way to solve that problem. And yet, what's getting ready to happen on a highway bill that is like really simple, I mean, it's unlike Medicare, it's unlike Medicaid, it's unlike so many of the things that we deal with around here that are so complex to get it just right. We have a highway bill, and it's kind of like math. It's not really complicated. There aren't all kinds of moving parts as far as people providing health care and the incentives that are in place. And what we're getting ready to do as a body it feels like to me, I hope this is not the case, is pass a highway bill where what we're going to do is exactly what we've done with what's called the sustainable growth rate for physicians in Medicare. Back in 1997, we passed a bill here, I wasn't here at the time, that basically created a mechanism for paying physicians and providers, physicians that dealt with seniors. And the formula was flawed, and so what we've done every 18 months or every year is caused the medical community to be panicked and seniors to be panicked over whether this is going to be extended, because the sustainable growth rate, as it was put forth, was going to cause for huge reductions in payments to physicians. We actually are dealing with that right now. It's one of the issues we're trying to work out with the House. And what we did was we created a cliff. So every time we deal with this issue, it gets more and more difficult to deal with it, because we will not just sit down and do the long-term reforms on that one component that need to happen. And so we keep taking from Peter to pay Paul. We keep wrestling with this issue, but we won't deal with it. And what we're getting ready to do with the highway bill is basically inject that same poisonous formula into the highway bill. What we're getting ready to do is, again, pass a highway bill that's going to fund highways through 2013. But at the end of that period of time, we're going to have the same kind of cliff that we deal with SGR. We've got a $10 billion shortfall. So instead of just dealing with a funding formula, I mean, if we don't think we're spending enough on infrastructure and people want to alter that in some way, now's the time to do it. Otherwise, if people don't want to go into a deficit situation, what we ought to do is spend the amount of money that's coming in. But what it feels like to me is getting ready to happen when we get back from recess is, in a very bipartisan way, we're going to show the country that to think about doing the kind of reforms to Medicare to make it solvent, to think about doing the kind of things that we need to do with Social Security, both of which are more complex, is ridiculous with this Congress, because this Congress won't even deal with a little program. It's a very important program, very important to my state, I'm sure important to Vermont. But we won't even deal with the reforms to it in this time of great concern about our fiscal situation. Again, I strongly support infrastructure funding. So I think what it's going to show to the country is that if we pass a bill like this in a strong bipartisan way, that basically Congress is demonstrating that there's very little hope that we ever are going to deal with the more complex issues that challenge this country, cause many seniors in our country to be concerned, cause taxpayers to be very concerned, and certainly cause future generations to wonder whether this body is ever going to deal with the issues that they know will haunt them down the road. So, Mr. President, I came down here to speak to this. I've done it daily in the lunch meetings that we have with our own side. And I just hope that sometime over the recess period, prior to coming to the floor, that the Finance Committee will come up with a different package that actually either pays for this bill by altering funding formulas, which, by the way, are just, it's math. It's just math. It's not very difficult. Or where we spend the amount of money that's actually coming in. I will say that states do have the ability, if they so chose to, if we spent just the base monies that are coming in, states like Vermont and Tennessee and other places have the ability, if they choose, to generate gasoline tax in their own states and do things with road money. And candidly, the way this program works, I think most people know that citizens send up $1 and they get back 98 cents. So it actually could be a more efficient way for this to work than sending it up to us and letting us get our hands on part of the money and figuring out what we're going to do with it. But the fact is that I really do believe this is one of the most irresponsible things that we can do, especially when I think that there may have been some criticisms of the President's budget. I haven't heard a lot of people speak about it because I don't think it's been taken as a document that we're actually going to take up on this floor in a real way. But it's really difficult to criticize the President's budget I know last year's budget was 97-0 against, but it's very difficult for people on either side of the aisle to criticize the President's budget if, in fact, there's a large bipartisan desire to pass a highway bill that does exactly the same thing. So, again, I hope the Finance Committee will meet again and will come up with a solution to this. It's not urgent. We have a recess period that's coming up, and surely that this Congress, this Senate can show the ability to deal with an issue like this, again, that's so simple, and demonstrate to the American people that in a bipartisan way we have the ability to begin looking at these programs that are so important to people across our country in a way that doesn't take us down the fiscal tube. Mr. President, I thank you for listening. I know it's tough when there's not much happening.